The groan of the heavy-duty tires on packed snow was the only sound that had mattered for the last hour. Inside the cab of the Ford F-250, the heater whirred on its highest setting, fighting a losing battle against the Alaskan winter seeping through the seals. The temperature gauge on the dash read -27 Fahrenheit. A Tuesday, or maybe it was Wednesday. In the deep, suffocating dark of a Fairbanks December, the days bled into one another, marked only by the start and end of a shift. Ever get used to it, Leo? Ben's voice was a soft intrusion into the mechanical symphony. He was staring out the passenger window, at the endless wall of black spruce trees that lined the service road, their snow-laden branches like skeletal arms. Leo grunted, his eyes fixed on the narrow cone of light carved out by the truck's high beams. Get used to what? The cold, the dark, the profound certainty that if this engine dies, we become human popsicles in about 45 minutes. Ben chuckled, a nervous, breathy sound. The dark, mostly. It feels like it's pressing in, like it weighs something. He wasn't wrong. At 24, Ben was still new to this. New to the North. New to the long-haul patrol contract that had them checking on remote corporate assets and private properties scattered across miles of unforgiving wilderness. He'd come up from Oregon 6 months ago, chasing the money and the myth of the last frontier. Leo, on the other hand, was born in it. At 42, the Alaskan darkness was an old, familiar acquaintance. He didn't like it, but he respected it. You don't get used to it, Leo said, his tone softening slightly. You just learn where the edges are, you learn not to step over them. They drove in silence for another 10 minutes, the truck's cabin a tiny, mobile island of warmth and light in an ocean of cold and black. Ben was a good kid. A little green, a little too chatty when he was nervous, but he was earnest and he learned fast. He had a wife and a baby girl back in town, and a picture of them was taped to his sun visor. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, Leo would see him glance up at it. The static crackle of the radio was sharp and sudden, making both men jump. Patrol Unit 7, this is dispatch. Do you copy? Leo grabbed the mic. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Go ahead, Sarah. Got a silent alarm ping from the old Culture property out on Chena Hot Springs Road. Section 4. You boys are the closest, by a long shot. Leo frowned, exchanging a look with Ben. The Culture place was a defunct geological research station, bought out by an Anchorage conglomerate 2 years ago and left to rot. It was supposed to be fully winterized and shuttered until spring. A silent alarm, Sarah? Are we sure? Place should be dead as a doornail. That's what the system says. Main building, motion sensor in the primary lab. Could be a moose leaning on a weak door frame, could be a wiring short from the cold. But policy is policy. You need to lay eyes on it. 10-4, dispatch. We're about 20 minutes out. We'll check it and report back. Unit 7 clear. Leo hung the mic back on its cradle. He sighed, the sound loud in the quiet cab. There goes our quiet night. Ben shifted in his seat, his earlier unease now sharpened with a new focus. You think someone's out there. Squatters, doubt it, Leo said, turning the truck onto a narrower, unplowed access road. The snow here was deeper, and the truck began to labor. You'd have to be a special kind of desperate or a special kind of stupid to try and squat in that place. No power, no heat, it's a tomb. As they got closer, the forest seemed to grow denser, the trees crowding the road. The headlights reflected off a million tiny ice crystals suspended in the air, a phenomenon the locals called diamond dust. It was beautiful, but it cut visibility. The world outside the truck became a swirling vortex of white and black. Finally, a dark, angular shape emerged from the gloom. The Culture Research Station. It was a long, low-slung, prefabricated building, with a few smaller sheds behind it. It looked abandoned, desolate, but there was something wrong. A faint, pale light glowed from one of the windows in the main building. Okay, Ben breathed, pointing. That's not a moose. Leo pulled the truck to a stop about 100 yards away and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the whistling of the wind and the faint ticking of the cooling engine block. No, it's not. He unclipped his sidearm. a heavy .44 Magnum, not for people, but for the other things that roamed the Alaskan night. Gear up, long guns, headlamps. They pulled on their heavy parkas, checked the shotguns from the rack behind their seats, and switched on their headlamps. The moment Leo opened his door, the cold attacked. It was a physical presence, stealing the air from his lungs and stinging his exposed skin like 1,000 needles. The air was so cold it felt sharp, brittle. They moved forward cautiously, boots crunching on the pristine snow. The light in the window flickered and went out. The silence returned, deeper this time. "Leo," Ben whispered, his voice tight. "Tracks." He was right. A single set of footprints led from the dense tree line toward the main building's front entrance. They were small, indistinct in the powdery snow, but they were fresh. What was unsettling was the lack of any other tracks. No snow machine, no ATV, no truck. Just this one set of prints, appearing out of the woods and leading to the door. They reached the entrance, a heavy steel door set into the building. It was slightly ajar, a black slit in the darkness. Leo held up a hand, signaling for quiet. He could hear nothing from inside. No voices, no movement. "This feels wrong," Ben murmured, his shotgun held at a low ready. "Check the back," Leo ordered in a low voice. "Circle around, cover the rear exit. I'll take the front. Keep your radio open. We go in on my signal." Ben nodded, his face pale in the harsh glare of his headlamp. "Got it." He peeled away, his form moving silently toward the far corner of the building. Leo watched his light bob and weave until it was swallowed by the shadows at the corner. He turned his attention back to the door, took a deep breath that burned his lungs, and prepared to push it open. That's when he heard it. Not a gunshot, not a scream. It was a sharp, wet thump, like a heavy bag of sand being dropped from a height. It was followed by an instantaneous, profound silence. The wind itself seemed to die. Every nerve in Leo's body screamed. "Ben," he called, his voice tight. No answer. "Ben, status?" Only the whisper of the returning wind. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his professional calm. He abandoned the front door and sprinted toward the corner where Ben had disappeared, his heavy boots sinking into the deep snow, his heart hammering against his ribs. He rounded the corner, his headlamp beam slicing frantically through the darkness. The back of the building was a long, flat wall with a single steel door in the middle. There was nothing else. No one. "Ben," he yelled, his voice swallowed by the immense emptiness. He saw Ben's tracks in the snow. They led from the front, around the corner, and stopped dead in the middle of the empty space behind the building. They just ended. There were no other tracks. No signs of a struggle, no drag marks. Nothing. Just a set of footprints leading to a patch of undisturbed snow, as if the man wearing the boots had been lifted straight up into the night sky. Ben was gone. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Leo did nothing. He just stood there, the beam of his flashlight fixed on the last indentation Ben's boot had made in the snow. The silence was no longer the quiet of a remote wilderness night. It was a profound, suffocating void. It was the sound of absence. The cold, which seconds before had just been a physical fact of the job, now felt predatory, seeping through his layers and coiling in his stomach. "Ben!" Leo's voice was a low croak, absorbed instantly by the dense, frozen air. He cleared his throat, forcing more volume. "Ben, cut the crap, this isn't funny." His shout echoed weakly off the silent, dark facade of the research station and was swallowed by the endless expanse of black spruce trees. There was no reply, not a laugh, not a call back. Nothing but the whisper of a rising wind through the high branches. Training kicked in, a lifetime of drilled procedure fighting against the rising tide of pure, primal fear. Assess the scene. Look for evidence. He walked the line of Ben's tracks again, his own boots crunching loudly in the otherwise silent world. The steps were even, unhurried, not the tracks of a man running from something. They led from the corner of the building, straight out into the open clearing behind the station. And then they just stopped. Perfectly formed boot prints, and then a smooth, unbroken blanket of white. Leo swept his flashlight beam in a wide, frantic arc. He scanned the snow around the final print. It was pristine, untouched. No drag marks. No sign of a scuffle. No other tracks, animal or human. He aimed the powerful beam upwards, searching the low-hanging branches of the nearby spruces. Nothing broken, nothing disturbed. He scanned the roof of the single-story building. A low, flat roof, covered in a thick layer of snow, its edges sharp and clean against the star-dusted sky. There was no way Ben could have leaped or been pulled up there without leaving a single trace. Panic began to shred the edges of his professional composure. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the night's oppressive silence. "Ben!" he roared, the name torn from his lungs, raw with a desperation that scared him. "Answer, Emmy, damn it!" The only answer was the wind, which was picking up now, carrying fine, sharp crystals of snow that stung his exposed cheeks. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand here. He started a circular search pattern, spiraling out from the last footprint, his flashlight beam cutting frantically through the darkness. He kicked at the snow, hoping to uncover a hidden trapdoor, a great anything. He found only more frozen, unforgiving earth beneath the powder. The impossibility of it was a physical blow. People don't just evaporate. Men don't just vanish from the ground, leaving nothing behind. His mind raced, desperately seeking a logical anchor. A prank? Ben wasn't the type. He was young, but serious about the job. He knew the dangers of the Alaskan winter. A hidden sinkhole, a crevasse. Unlikely here, so far from the glaciers, and it would have left a gaping hole, a disturbance. An animal? A bear or moose would have left a crater in the snow, and tracks of its own. There was nothing. It was as if the ground had simply opened and closed without a ripple, or the sky had plucked him straight up. He felt a wave of nausea. He was alone. Utterly and completely alone in the middle of nowhere with something that made no sense. The muffled thump he'd heard, was that the sound of Ben disappearing? The thought was so insane he almost laughed, a hysterical sound that died in his throat. Guilt, cold and sharp, pierced through the panic. "You cover the back. I'll take the front." His own words. He'd sent him back here. He'd sent the rookie into the darkness alone while the veteran took the main door. A knot of ice formed in his gut. He stumbled back towards the patrol vehicle, his legs feeling unsteady. His hand, clumsy with cold and trembling with adrenaline, fumbled for the radio on his shoulder harness. He pressed the button, his thumb slipping twice on the frozen plastic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Come in, dispatch." His voice was thin, strained. The reply was immediate, a calm, familiar voice cutting through the static. "Go ahead, Unit 7. This is Sarah. What's your status, Leo?" Leo took a shaky breath, the frigid air burning his lungs. How did he say this? How did he report the impossible? "Sarah, I have a situation here at the Kilcher property. A 10-100. Officer down." The code felt wrong, inadequate. Sarah's tone shifted instantly, losing its casual calm. "Leo, clarify, is your partner injured? Do you require medical?" "No, not injured. He's gone." "Gone? Define gone, Leo." Did he pursue a suspect? "Did you lose visual?" "No, you don't understand." Leo's voice cracked, the carefully constructed wall of professionalism crumbling completely. He looked back at the empty space in the snow, the flashlight beam shaking violently in his hand. "He's just gone, vanished. I was at the front of the building, he was at the back. I heard a noise, came back here, and he's gone. His footprints, Sarah, his footprints just stop. In the middle of the clearing. They just end." There was a long pause on the other end. Leo could picture Sarah in the warm, brightly lit dispatch center, frowning at her console. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind howling around the truck's cab. "Unit 7, she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Can you repeat that? You're saying your partner's tracks stop in an open area with no other marks?" The skepticism was plain, a hammer blow to his already fragile state. "Yes, that's what I'm saying. There's nothing here. He was here 1 minute and now he's not." "Leo, is it possible the wind has obscured the tracks? Or he found cover you can't see from your position?" "No." He yelled, then immediately regretted it, lowering his voice. Sarah, listen to me. The snow it's perfect. It's undisturbed. There is no explanation. Something happened here. Something is wrong. Another pause, longer this time. He knew what she was thinking, that he was panicking, that he was seeing things, that the cold and the dark were getting to him. Okay, Leo, Sarah said, her voice now overly calm, the kind you use on a panicked victim. Stay with your vehicle. I'm dispatching the sheriff's department to your location. Sergeant Miller is on shift. ETA is about 30 minutes. Just stay put, Leo, okay? Don't go back in there. Wait for backup. Roger, he mumbled, his hand falling from the radio. 30 minutes. An eternity. He was alone, with the wind and the darkness and the impossible, empty space where his partner should be. The first few flakes of a fresh snowfall began to drift down, lazy and white in his flashlight beam, threatening to bury the only proof that any of this was real. The only proof that he wasn't losing his mind. The first sign of their arrival was a faint, rhythmic pulse of blue and red against the dense curtain of falling snow. It grew stronger, painting the skeletal arms of the birch trees in fleeting, ghostly colors. Then came the sound, the low growl of a heavy-duty engine and the distinct crunch of tires chewing through fresh powder. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Leo wasn't alone. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him, but it was immediately chased by a cold shot of dread. Now came the hard part, the part where he had to make them believe. The sheriff's department SUV, a formidable black and white Ford Explorer, pulled to a stop behind his patrol truck, its headlights cutting twin cones through the swirling flakes. The driver's side door opened, and a large, broad-shouldered man emerged, pulling the collar of his thick parka up against the wind. Even in the dim light, Leo recognized the stern, weathered face of Sergeant Frank Miller. Miller was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man who had seen everything the Alaskan frontier could throw at someone and had met it all with a granite-faced pragmatism. He knew Leo not well, but they'd shared coffee and quiet nods at the station for years. Leo. Miller's voice was a low rumble, devoid of alarm. He crunched across the snow, his young deputy, Evans, following a step behind with a large flashlight. Dispatch said you sounded agitated. Talk to me. What's the situation? Leo's words, bottled up by fear and disbelief, came tumbling out in a frantic rush. Frank, it's Ben, he's gone. He just vanished. He pointed a trembling, gloved hand toward the clearing. His tracks, look, they just stop. He was right there. I sent him around back, I heard a noise, and when I came to check it, he was gone. Miller's gaze followed Leo's finger, his expression unreadable. He didn't immediately rush to the tracks. Instead, his eyes scanned the entire area. The station, the tree line, Leo's truck, and finally, Leo himself. It was a slow, methodical assessment, the kind of look that made you feel like you were being measured for a cage. Vanished, Miller repeated, the word hanging in the frigid air like a puff of smoke. People don't just vanish, Leo. I know how it sounds. Leo's voice cracked with desperation. Just look, please. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of every strange call he'd ever answered, Miller trudged forward. Evans followed, his powerful beam sweeping across the snow, illuminating the impossible scene in stark white light. Miller crouched down at the end of Ben's trail, his gloved finger hovering over the last, perfect boot print. He looked up at Leo, his eyes narrowed. Where were you standing when this happened? Over there, Leo said, pointing back toward the corner of the building. By the generator housing, I heard a snap like a branch breaking, but heavier. And you saw it happen? No. He was gone when I got here, a few seconds later. Miller stood up, brushing snow from his knees. He looked at Evans. Any other tracks? Snowmobile? Animal? Evans swept his light in a wide arc. Negative, Sarge, nothing. Just guard Leo's prints coming from the building and the victim's prints stopping here. The snow is undisturbed for at least 50 yards in every direction. Miller grunted. He pulled a long, thin metal probe from a pouch on his belt and began systematically pushing it into the snow where the tracks ended. It hit the frozen ground with a dull thud every time. Thud, thud, thud. No hidden cellar. No septic tank lid. It's solid. He looked back at Leo, a flicker of something, annoyance, suspicion in his eyes. You had anything to drink tonight, Leo? Be straight with me. The question felt like a physical slap. What? No. Frank, for God's sake, I'm telling you the truth. Ben is missing. I'm just asking the questions I have to ask, Miller said calmly, though his tone was sharp. Right now, I have a missing rookie and a partner who's telling me he evaporated. The most likely scenario here is that your man got cold feet, decided this job wasn't for him, and walked off. Walked off where? Leo gestured wildly. Make it make sense, Frank. There are no tracks leading away. How did he leave? I don't know yet, Miller admitted, his gaze turning toward the dark, silent research station. The falling snow was getting heavier, beginning to soften the sharp edges of the footprints. They were a melting clock. Maybe he's playing a prank. Hiding, maybe someone he knew was waiting for him. He paused, then looked up at the sky. No chopper could fly in this weather, but a snowmobile could have come from the woods, and he could have hopped on. We would have heard a snowmobile, Sarge, Evans offered quietly. Miller shot him a look that silenced him immediately. The sergeant's focus was entirely on Leo. He was testing him, pushing him, looking for the cracks in his impossible story. But Leo's fear was too real, too raw. He wasn't cracking, he was shattering. A sense of utter hopelessness began to settle over Leo, colder than the wind. He was the only witness to something that broke the rules of the world, and he was being looked at like a drunk or a fool. The guilt was a physical weight in his stomach. I sent him back there alone, my partner, my responsibility. Finally, Miller seemed to reach the end of his logical rope. The scene offered no conventional answers. He kicked at a drift of snow in frustration. All right, he said, his voice tight. He turned his attention fully to the station. The call was for a silent alarm here. You mentioned a light. Leo seized on the change of topic, grateful to be talking about something tangible. Yeah, in that second-story window, he pointed. It was just for a second, a blue-white flash. That's what made me stop in the first place. Miller stared at the dark window for a long moment, the gears turning behind his eyes. The mystery of the footprints was a dead end, a maddening, illogical loop. But the station was a locked box. And the original alarm, the reason they were all standing here freezing, had come from inside it. We're losing the scene out here, Miller declared, gesturing to the prints that were now just shallow depressions. Whatever happened, the only evidence is about to be buried. We're done here for now. He turned to his deputy. Evans, get the bolt cutters and the pry bar from the truck. Evans nodded and jogged back to the SUV. Miller faced the station's heavy, padlocked front door. His face was set like stone, a mask of grim determination. The questions about the snow could wait. The immediate, actionable problem was the building. The alarm came from inside, he said, as much to himself as to Leo. The light you saw was inside, and we're out of answers out here. He looked at Leo, his eyes holding a new kind of intensity. We're going in. The crunch of Deputy Evans's boots in the fresh snow was the only sound for a moment, a rhythmic counterpoint to the howling wind. He returned from the cruiser with a heavy-duty pry bar, its steel length gleaming dully under the sweeping beams of their flashlights. He handed it to Miller without a word, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Miller took the tool, weighing it in his gloved hands. He was a man of process, of tangible reality. A locked door was a problem with a physical solution. He wedged the tip of the bar into the seam between the heavy steel door and its frame. Leo, keep your light steady on the lock, he commanded, his voice a low grunt of effort. Evans, cover our six. I don't want any more surprises. Leo complied, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly despite his effort to hold it still. The guilt was a cold, hard knot in his gut, tighter than the fear. Every second that passed felt like a personal failure. Evans moved back toward the cruiser, his weapon drawn, his silhouette a dark, watchful shape against the swirling snow. The first groan of stressed metal was shockingly loud, echoing across the desolate landscape. Miller put his shoulder into it, grunting with exertion. The wood around the lock splintered. Another heave, and a loud crack ripped through the air. With a final, violent wrench, the door shuddered open, revealing a wall of absolute darkness. The air that rolled out was stale and even colder than outside, carrying a faint, musty scent of ozone and dust. It was the smell of a place long sealed, a tomb. "All right," Miller breathed, stepping back and pulling his own flashlight. "We go in slow and clear. Evans, you're with me. Leo, you're on our tail. Announce everything you see. We stick together. No one goes anywhere alone." "Clear? Clear," Evans and Leo replied in unison. Their voices were small against the vast, oppressive silence of the station's interior. They entered in a tight formation, a triangle of light cutting through the black. The entrance hall was Spartan, clinical. A reception desk coated in a thick layer of dust stood empty. A few chairs were overturned, as if knocked over in a hurry long ago. Their boots crunched on fallen ceiling tiles and unseen debris. Every sound was magnified. Every shadow seemed to dance at the edge of their lights. "Clear left," Evans announced, his beam sweeping across a short hallway ending in a closed door. "Clear right," Miller said, illuminating another corridor, this one longer, lined with more closed doors bearing faded labels. Geology, meteorology, admin. The entire place was dead. No hum of electricity, no thrum of a heating system. It was a metal and concrete shell, frozen solid. They moved deeper, a slow, methodical sweep. Office after office revealed the same scene of long-abandoned work. Papers were scattered, coffee mugs sat stained on desks, calendars were still turned to a date years ago. It was a perfect time capsule of a place evacuated with little notice. "Sarge," Leo whispered, his voice tight. "This doesn't make any sense. The alarm was triggered tonight. This place looks like it's been dead for a decade." "I see that, Leo," Miller replied, his own frustration starting to show. One thing at a time. It was as they were about to clear the last room in the main corridor that Evans stopped dead. "Hold up," he said, tilting his head. "Do you hear that?" Leo and Miller froze, straining their ears. Over the muted howl of the wind outside, there was another sound. A low, almost subsonic hum. It was faint, a vibration felt more than heard, resonating through the soles of their boots. "It's coming from down there," Miller said, pointing his light toward a heavy-duty door at the far end of the hall, marked with a faded biohazard symbol and the words Spectrometry Lab, restricted access. Unlike the others, this door was ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning them. As they approached, the humming grew stronger. Miller pushed the door open, revealing a short flight of metal stairs leading down. The air here was different. The scent of ozone was sharp, and there was a palpable static charge in the atmosphere. They descended cautiously, the hum growing into a distinct, rhythmic pulse. The lab at the bottom was the source. Banks of servers and complex machinery lined the walls, their surfaces covered in a constellation of blinking green and amber lights. A single large monitor in the center of the room glowed with a complex, oscillating waveform of brilliant blue light, bathing the room in an ethereal glow. "What the hell?" Evans breathed, his flashlight beam wavering over the equipment. "The whole station's dead, but this lab is running on its own power grid." The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the station. It was clean, almost sterile, save for a cluster of papers strewn across a console next to the glowing monitor and a half-full coffee mug, steam still faintly rising from its surface. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He stepped forward, his light falling on the mug. It was a standard-issue security thermos, identical to the one Ben had been carrying. Next to it was a half-eaten protein bar, the wrapper for a Yukon Gold Crunch bar, Ben's favorite. "Miller," Leo said, his voice cracking. "He was here. Ben was in this room." Miller moved to the console, his face grim. He ignored the mug for a moment, his professional focus zeroing in on the papers. He picked one up, his flashlight illuminating hastily scribbled notes and complex equations. The handwriting grew increasingly frantic across the pages. Signal resonance exceeding theoretical limits, unstable cascade. "The waveform is not collapsing, it's folding," Miller read aloud, his brow furrowed in confusion. This is way above my pay grade. Sounds like a science experiment went sideways. He turned his attention to the computer screen. The blue waveform pulsed in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. At the bottom of the screen, a single line of text blinked. System log, anomalous event detected. Final sequence initiated. Timestamp, 2:14 a.m. That was 15 minutes before our dispatch, Evans noted, looking at his watch. Right around the time Leo said he saw the light. Miller stared at the screen, then at the fresh coffee, then back at the incomprehensible notes. The clean, logical lines of his investigation were blurring into something messy and strange. Ben wasn't a deserter. He hadn't been attacked by an animal. He had been lured or had followed someone into this room. And then, what? As the three men stood in the humming, pulsing heart of the dead station, trying to piece together an impossible puzzle, a new sound cut through the air. It came from deeper within the sublevel, beyond another sealed door at the back of the lab. Thump, scrape, thump, a slow, metallic, dragging sound. It was heavy, and it was getting closer. The sound echoed again, a heavy, grating scrape that vibrated through the concrete floor. It was rhythmic, methodical. Scrape, drag, pause. Scrape, drag, a pause. It was the sound of dead weight being moved with unnatural persistence. Miller's hand shot up, a silent command for stillness. Evans, his face a mask of trained focus, already had his weapon in a low-ready position. Its mounted light cutting a sharp, white cone into the darkness beyond the lab's doorway. Leo felt his own breath catch in his throat, a raw, primal fear clutching at him, cold and sharp as the Alaskan air outside. Every horror movie trope he'd ever seen played out in his mind, but this was different. This was real. The sound wasn't the frantic scrabbling of an animal or the pained groan of a human. It was mechanical, soulless. "It's coming from deeper in," Miller whispered, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the air. He gestured with his head towards a narrow service corridor leading away from the opposite side of the lab. "That's our only way forward." Leo swallowed hard, the sound loud in the oppressive silence between scrapes. "What do you think it is, Sergeant?" Miller's eyes, grim and calculating, met his. "Only one way to find out. Evans, you take point. I'm behind you. Leo, you stay between us. Don't touch anything. Your light on mine." There was no room for argument. Leo fumbled with his heavy-duty flashlight, its beam dancing nervously before he steadied it, overlapping it with Miller's. The three men moved as a unit, stepping out of the relative brightness of the lab and into the throat of the dark corridor. The air grew colder here, mustier, with a distinct smell of ozone and cold steel. The walls were bare, reinforced concrete, lined with thick conduits and pipes that wept condensation. Their boots echoed on the grated metal floor, a counterpoint to the relentless scraped drag that grew louder with every step. It was a claustrophobic advance. The corridor was barely wide enough for them to walk single file, forcing them into an intimacy that magnified the tension. Leo could hear the soft rustle of Miller's jacket behind him, feel the man's presence like a physical weight. Ahead, Evans moved with a fluid, predatory grace, his flashlight beam methodically sweeping every corner, every shadow before they advanced. The sound was deafening now, an industrial torment that seemed to emanate from just around the next bend. Evans held up a fist, pausing at the threshold of a much larger space. He peeked around the corner, then pulled back, looking at Miller and shaking his head slightly. Miller gestured for him to proceed. They stepped out of the corridor and into a cavernous, two-story chamber. The ceiling was lost in darkness, but the floor was a vast expanse of metal grating. In the center, under the combined glare of their three lights, was the source of the noise. It was not a man. It wasn't a creature. It was a machine. A massive, automated robotic arm, the kind used in manufacturing or hazardous material handling, was mounted to a track on the ceiling. One of its heavy hydraulic limbs was clearly damaged, bent at an unnatural angle. It was this limb that was dragging across the floor. The machine was trapped in a loop, its programming compelling it to complete a task its broken body could no longer perform. It would extend, its damaged arm scraping a long, ugly gash in the metal floor, then retract with a heavy thump as the hydraulics strained, before starting the cycle all over again. Scrape, drag, thump. The anticlimax was a strange, hollow relief. There was no monster, but the unease remained, settling deeper. What was this place? What was this machine for? Automated sorting and disposal, Miller said, his voice echoing in the large chamber as he swept his light around. Look, he pointed his beam towards the far wall. There, set into the concrete, were 3 massive, lead-lined blast doors, each marked with a biohazard symbol and faded stenciling. Leo could just make out the words on the nearest one, Specimen Containment 1. The truth of the Culture Station fell into place with chilling certainty. This wasn't a simple research outpost. It was a containment facility. The scattered notes in the lab, the talk of a waveform cascade, it wasn't theoretical research. It was an active experiment, and this place was built to contain the results. Jesus Christ, Evans muttered, lowering his weapon slightly. What were they keeping in here? Leo's mind flashed back to the footprints. To Ben, vanishing into thin air. He wasn't just missing, he was caught up in whatever had been unleashed from this place. As Miller and Evans moved cautiously toward the containment doors, examining the heavy locking mechanisms, Leo's gaze was drawn back to the relentlessly scraping machine. It was a monument to a system gone wrong, a mindless automaton executing a dead man's orders. His light traced the path of the arm's futile work. It scraped its way toward a control console built into a low wall near the chamber's edge. Something was glinting there, just under the lip of the console, where the dragging arm couldn't quite reach. It was small, plastic, overlooked. "Sergeant," Leo called out, his voice hoarse. He walked over, keeping a wide berth from the flailing machine, and knelt down. Tucked in the recess was a security key card, its corner cracked. A strip of white tape was affixed to it, with a name written in faded marker, Dr. A. Reid. Attached to the card's lanyard, folded into a small, grimy plastic sleeve, was a piece of paper. Leo carefully worked it free. It was a small, partial schematic of the sublevels, hastily highlighted in yellow. A single room was circled in red pen, the label next to it read, Central Mainframe. He stood and brought it to Miller. The sergeant took the card and the map, his flashlight beam illuminating the circled room. The dragging of the broken machine continued its maddening rhythm behind them, a constant reminder of their isolation and the station's catastrophic failure. Miller looked from the map to the dark corridor that led even deeper into the facility. The path on the schematic seemed to lead that way. The lab computer, the waveform cascade, the containment cells, and now this. It was all connected. "Reed's card," Miller said, holding it up. "Maybe this gets us into the system. The mainframe, if there are any answers to be had, they'll be in there." He met Leo's eyes, then Evans'. The initial mission to find a missing security guard had become something else entirely. Now, it was about finding out what happened here before anyone else did. "All right," Miller declared, his voice cutting through the mechanical din. "We're going to the mainframe." The rhythmic clang of the robotic arm faded behind them, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the concrete corridor. In his hand, Miller held the 2 pieces of their puzzle, a fractured keycard and a laminated map, its surface clouded with age. He traced the highlighted path with a gloved finger, his breath a small, white cloud in the beam of his flashlight. "All right," Miller said, his voice a low anchor in the vast emptiness. "According to this, the mainframe hub isn't in the industrial wing. It's routed through the station's core, past the residential block. Strange layout. Designed to keep the science separate from the scientists, maybe," Evans offered quietly, his shotgun held at a low ready. Leo said nothing. His focus was singular, a burning point of desperation in his chest. Ben, the mainframe was the only thing that might hold an answer. He clutched the strap of his rifle, the cold metal a poor substitute for the certainty he craved. The map was their only guide, a relic from a time before the silence fell. They moved with practiced efficiency, a triangle of light cutting through the gloom. The path twisted away from the industrial decay into a section that was unnervingly personal. They passed a closed commissary, the faint outline of tables and chairs visible through a grimy window. Then a door marked recreation area. A profound sense of violation hung in the air, as if they were trespassing through a mass grave. The map led them to a door labeled Crew Quarters, Sector B. It was slightly ajar. Miller pushed it open with the barrel of his rifle. The space beyond was a small common room, a snapshot of lives interrupted. A game of chess sat on a low table, pieces frozen mid-move. Mugs furred with ancient mold rested on a counter, but it was a desk in the corner that drew Leo's attention. It was covered in a chaotic sprawl of papers, books, and what looked like a personal datapad. A nameplate on the desk read Dr. Eris Thorne, the name from Ben's notes. "Miller," Leo called out, his voice hushed. "This is him, the guy Ben was reading about." Miller and Evans moved closer. While Evans kept watch on the hallway, Miller carefully examined the desk. He picked up the datapad. Its screen was dark, the battery long dead. But beside it, lying open, was a leather-bound journal. The last entry was written in a hurried, spidery script, the ink slightly smeared. Miller angled his light onto the page. "Listen to this," he murmured, and began to read aloud. "December 12th. Final preparations. The energy readings are higher than anticipated. Theoretical models suggested a stable resonance, but the preliminary tests are showing microfractures in the baseline. A beautiful, terrible instability. Jensen is worried. He says we're tearing a hole in the fabric of things. I told him that's the point. We're not tearing a hole, we're opening a door. Tomorrow, we knock. I feel a tremor of anticipation, or perhaps it is fear. They feel so much alike." Leo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan cold. The words resonated with the frantic energy he'd seen in Ben's scribbles. They weren't just doing research, they were chasing something reckless, something that scared even them. "Let's keep moving," Miller said, his tone grim. He placed the journal back on the desk, a final, silent testament to Dr. Thorne's ambition. The corridors beyond the quarters grew cleaner, the decay less pronounced. The walls were reinforced, the lighting fixtures more robust, though most were dark. They were entering the station's protected heart. Finally, they reached their destination, a heavy, pressurized steel door with a single digital keypad and card reader. Central Mainframe was stenciled above it in severe black letters. "Here we go," Evans muttered, stepping back to cover their rear. Miller approached the panel. He carefully inserted the two broken pieces of the keycard into the slot, trying to line up the magnetic strip. He pressed them in firmly. The panel beeped once, a hostile red light flashing. "Access D and IED card, DAMAGED." Leo's heart sank. "Damn it." "Hold on," Miller said, his eyes scanning the keypad. "Old system. These often have a maintenance bypass, a failsafe for when the digital lock fails." He pulled a small multi-tool from his vest and deftly unscrewed the panel's faceplate. Inside was a web of wires. He ignored most of them, his light focusing on a small set of terminals near the bottom. If you complete the circuit on the manual release, you can sometimes force the maglock to cycle. He worked for a tense minute, his movements precise. Leo could hear nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the faint scrape of metal on metal. Then, a sharp click, followed by a loud hiss of decompressing air. The heavy door unsealed, sliding open a few inches with a deep groan. Together, they pushed it open. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the rest of the station. It was cavernously large, frigid, and filled with the low, constant hum of machinery. Racks of servers stood in silent rows, their blinking green and amber lights reflecting off the polished floor like a digital constellation. In the center of the room sat a single, large console, its main monitor glowing with a soft blue light, an unblinking eye in the darkness. "The heart of the beast," Miller breathed, moving towards it. He sat down, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Let's see what secrets you're keeping." The system was archaic but functional. Miller's fingers flew across the keys, bypassing dormant security protocols and digging through nested directories. He searched for keywords from Ben's notes and Thorne's journal. Cascade, waveform, resonance. A list of files appeared. Most were raw data, indecipherable strings of numbers, but one was different. It was a video file labeled Experiment Log Final Test. Timestamp, 10 years ago, the day the station went silent. Leo Evans. "Get over here," Miller commanded. He clicked the file. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy, top-down security view of a laboratory. Leo recognized it from the schematics. Scientists, including a man he assumed was Dr. Thorne, moved with frantic purpose. An alarm, tinny and distorted through the old recording, began to blare. On-screen, Thorne shouted something, gesturing towards a large, central device that pulsed with a faint light. And then it happened. A distortion, like a ripple of intense heat, erupted from the device. It didn't explode, it simply expanded. The video quality degraded, filled with static. Through the interference, Leo watched in horror as the scientists began to glitch. Their forms flickered, stretching and compressing like corrupted data. One woman simply faded, her image growing transparent until she was gone. Another man was there one frame and absent the next. Within seconds, the lab was empty. The distortion wave pulsed one last time and then vanished, leaving behind an empty room and a blizzard of on-screen static. Leo felt sick. They just disappeared. Not just them, Miller said, his voice tight. He had another file open on a second monitor. External sensor log anomalous event. The timestamp was from a few hours ago, from the time Ben had vanished. The silent alarm Ben and I tripped. It must have drawn residual power to the perimeter sensors, Leo realized aloud. It triggered an echo. Miller nodded grimly, pointing to a line of text on the screen. It was a clinical, automated analysis of the event. Localized waveform cascade detected. Single biological signature identified. Pattern analysis indicates subject's quantum state has been destabilized. Matter composition has been dispersed. The word was cold, sterile, and utterly devastating. Leo stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process the clinical horror of the words. He looked at Miller, his voice barely a whisper. Dispersed? What does that mean? Where is he? Miller turned from the glowing monitor, his face a mask of grim finality. According to this, Leo, he's not somewhere. He is the disturbance. His matter, his energy, it was scattered. He's everywhere out there in the snow, and nowhere, all at the same time. The video file ended. The screen went black, reflecting the three stunned faces in the dim light of the mainframe room. For a long moment, the only sound was the low, steady hum of the servers and the distant, rhythmic groan of the failing station. The truth was worse than any monster they could have imagined. Ben wasn't taken. He wasn't lost. He was undone. Leo stared at the blank monitor, his breath catching in his throat. The image of the scientist dissolving into shimmering dust was burned into his mind. That was Ben. One moment a solid, living person, the next day scattered atoms. He felt a wave of nausea, a profound, hollow ache where his frantic hope used to be. It wasn't just loss, it was annihilation. "My God," Evans whispered, his voice hoarse. He backed away from the console, running a hand through his hair. Molecular disassembly. They built a machine that unmakes people. Miller's face was a mask of grim resolve. The investigator in him was gone, replaced by the sergeant responsible for the men under his command. He grabbed Leo by the shoulder, his grip firm and grounding. "Leo, look at me." Leo's eyes, unfocused, slowly shifted to meet Miller's. "There is nothing we can do for Ben," Miller said, his voice low and urgent, cutting through the shock. "He's gone, but we are not. This place is unstable. We're leaving. Now." As if on cue, a deep shudder ran through the facility. The overhead lights flickered violently, then half of them went out, plunging the room into a hazardous twilight. A high-pitched whine began to emanate from the walls, growing in intensity. An alarm, a synthesized, panicked voice, echoed from a speaker overhead. "Warning, primary containment field fluctuating. Auxiliary power failure imminent. Evacuate." "Evacuate? That's our cue," Evans said, already moving toward the door. Sarge, that sound, it's the same frequency from the lab. The cascade is destabilizing. They didn't need any more encouragement. They burst out of the mainframe room and back into the narrow corridor, the emergency strobes now casting long, dancing shadows that made the walls seem to close in. The path they had taken to get here was now a death trap. A conduit on the ceiling sparked, raining down hot metal. Further ahead, a section of the walkway had buckled, forcing them to climb over a mess of twisted steel. Leo moved on autopilot, his survival instincts finally overpowering his grief. The cold, sterile air of the station was now thick with the smell of ozone and hot wiring. The groans of the structure were deeper, more frequent, like a dying beast. He kept seeing Ben's face, laughing in the patrol car, complaining about the cold, his eyes wide with curiosity. Now, just a memory, as intangible as the dust he'd become. They reached the section with the malfunctioning robotic arm. It was no longer just dragging. Spasming erratically from the power surges, it slammed against the walls with brutal force, blocking their path completely. Each impact sent shudders through the floor. "No way through," Evans yelled over the din. Miller scanned the area, his flashlight beam cutting through the strobing darkness. There, the maintenance duct. He pointed to a small, grated panel near the floor, partially hidden behind a bank of dead machinery. It was a tight squeeze, but one by one they wrenched the grate open and crawled into the cramped, dusty space. Inside, the noise was muffled, but the vibrations were more intense. They shuffled forward on their hands and knees, the cold metal scraping against them. For Leo, the claustrophobic tunnel was a physical manifestation of his despair, dark, suffocating, with no room to breathe. He thought of the report he would have to write. Subject vanished. What could he say? Subject's molecular cohesion failed due to an unregistered physics event. They would lock him in a padded room. The weight of the secret they now carried felt heavier than the collapsing station above them. They emerged back into the main corridor, just before the turnoff to the subterranean lab. The main power finally gave out. The emergency lights died, the synthesized voice cut off mid-word, and the station was plunged into absolute, terrifying darkness. The only light was from their 3 flashlights, their beams seeming small and fragile against the immense black. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. It was a dead silence. The station had finally given up. "Steady," Miller's voice was calm, but taut. "We're close to the access stairs. Move slow, watch your footing." They passed the doorway to the lab where they'd found Ben's thermos. Leo paused, his light lingering on the threshold. Ben's last moments of normalcy were in that room. He'd been drinking coffee, maybe reading over the notes, trying to make sense of it all, just before he stepped outside and ceased to exist. A wave of profound sadness washed over him, a final acceptance of the irreversible truth. Ben wasn't coming back. There was no body to find, no grave to visit, just an empty space in the world. "Leo," Miller said gently. "Come on." Leo nodded, turned his back on the lab, and followed. They found the stairs and scrambled up, the air growing colder, cleaner. They burst through the final door into the main concourse and pushed their way through the breached entrance. The cold hit them like a physical blow, but it had never felt so welcome. The blizzard had passed. The first hints of dawn were painting the eastern sky in shades of pale gray and violet, illuminating a world that was still solid, still real. Behind them, a final, catastrophic groan echoed from the depths of the Culture station. With a deafening roar of tortured metal and collapsing earth, the ground beneath the entrance gave way. The entire front section of the facility collapsed inward, kicking up a massive cloud of snow and debris and sealing the entrance forever under tons of rock and steel. A deep tremor ran through the ground beneath their feet, and then silence. The station was a tomb. Its secret was buried with it. The 3 men stood there for a long time, their breath pluming in the frigid air, watching the dust settle in the quiet twilight of the Alaskan morning. They had survived. They had the truth. And they were utterly alone with it. Miller finally broke the silence, his voice heavy. "No one will ever believe us." Leo looked at the empty space in the snow where Ben's footprints had ended hours ago. The falling snow had nearly covered them now. It was as if he'd never been there at all. "I know," Leo said, his own voice hollow, "but we will." There was nothing more to say. They turned and began the long, silent walk back to their vehicles, leaving the dead station behind them, forever haunted by the man who vanished in front of them and the horrifying knowledge of how.